Okay, today we're going to be reading Matthew 24 and 25. These two chapters together make up what is called the Olivet Discourse. And the reason why they call it that is because it's a discourse that Jesus is giving while sitting on the Mount of Olives. This has a parallel section in Mark chapter 13, which we read, of course, when we read the book of Mark, and also in Luke chapter 21, I believe it is, which we haven't read yet directly, but we will get to. This is a very difficult, actually it really isn't that difficult. This is a very straightforward section that has been made complicated by people over the years. It's a relatively straightforward and simple passage that has been made difficult by men over the course of time. In order to fully understand it, we read through the Gospel of Mark, of course. We've read Mark 13 already. But in order to fully understand this section, we are going to flip back to Mark 13 as well as ahead to Luke 21 and get a couple different ways of viewing this material. Because we do kind of need to put the picture together in totality to understand fully what's being said here. This is a follow-up to the previous chapter, Matthew 23. Which itself was a follow-up to the previous chapter of Matthew 22 and 21 when Jesus was in the temple confronting the authorities. So he came into the city. This is still Tuesday of Holy Week. He came into the city late in the day on Sunday, which we call Palm Sunday. The crowds greeted him. He came in, he looked around, and then he went back out to the Mount of Olives, or went back out. We learn in John that he stayed in the house of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha during the week. Mark, of course, tells us that this was two separate days. Matthew kind of combines it all into one day. That's why we need to have like the whole gospel account to get the full picture. And then Monday he gets up, he goes back out to the city. On the way he curses the fig tree. He sees the fig tree that has leaves but no figs and curses it. And the apostles, who apparently are presumably following behind him, hear him curse the tree. They go into the city. That's when Jesus overturns the temple, the money tables, and the temple, the money changers, and the merchants who are selling animals to be sacrificed, presumably at exorbitant prices for the poor. He does that on Monday, and apparently the rest of the day on Monday, he's just there teaching the crowds, and the authorities have not yet worked up the courage to challenge him. They can't have been happy with him overturning the temple, the market stalls they have set up in the temple, but they do not confront him on the day that he does that. They wait until Tuesday. So they go back to the Mount of Olives, they go back to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' house on Monday night. Tuesday they get up, they go back to the city. On the way they pass the fig tree again, and this time it's been withered down to the root. And then Jesus gives them a lesson about that to the apostles. Then they go back into the city, and this time the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and all the leaders get together and they challenge Jesus. They did not do that the day before. Apparently Jesus caught them off guard. They were concerned about I'm not sure why they didn't immediately press toward him and challenge him on Monday when he did it and waited a full day. I guess they just had to get their act together, I guess. But they do it on Tuesday, so Tuesday is a day of confrontation and controversy. He apparently goes there to teach, and the Pharisees this time, and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin and the Herodians even get in on the act. Like the authorities come after him and challenge him. They want to know where he gets his authority from. He chooses not to tell them. He asks them a question in response and says that if you answer my question, I will answer yours. It's the same answer to both questions. Because his answer is where John's authorities come from. And both John's case and Jesus' case, their authority came from heaven. So the leaders are not willing to admit that about John. And if they're not willing to admit that about John, they won't admit that about Jesus. So Jesus does not answer their question directly. Instead, he starts talking to them about parables. He's talking to them and he's talking about them. He's talking to them directly. He's telling them these parables. But these parables are about them. So he's talking to them and about them. And they realize it. They realize he's talking about them. So this makes them want to kill him even more. And then they start coming up to him after he's done apparently with his parables, they start coming up to him with questions, logic, puzzles, traps, trying to get him to say something that they can use to diminish his standing with the people. They try to get him to take one side or the other in terms of paying taxes to Caesar. If he says you should pay taxes to Caesar, he'll get in trouble with the people who want him to be their king. If he says you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, he'll get in trouble with Caesar. And they can point to that as a reason for the Roman authorities in Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate, and those people who are actually ruling Jerusalem on behalf of Rome, say this guy's a troublemaker to Rome, he needs to be gotten rid of. He doesn't either. He escapes that trap. Then the Sadducees come and try to ask him a logic puzzle about the resurrection. You read about that. Then they ask him which is the greatest commandment. He answers that question. He actually gives them 2 commandments. He actually answers the question even more than they asked. And then he asks them a question, whose son is the Christ? Or who is the Christ? Whose son is he? And they say the son of David, and then he follows up saying that how can he also be David's Lord? How can David's son also be David's Lord? How can he come after David and yet also have come before David? The only way he could do that is if he is the Son of God. And since he's claiming to be the Christ, all this pageantry and all this circumstance that he didn't do this in previous trips to Jerusalem. When he came here in the past, which we know from John, that he did make regular trips to Jerusalem, he didn't come in riding on a donkey with the crowds waving branches and putting their coats on the road in front of him. He did not do that before. He is doing that now. So he is claiming to be Israel's king. He is claiming to be this Messiah figure, the son of David. And he's asking them, who is the son of David, and how can David call him Lord if he is David's son? Well, the only way he can do that is if he is also the Son of God. And since Jesus is claiming to be this character, that means he is the Son of God. And they can't answer that question without admitting that Jesus is the Son of God. So they just go silent, and they never challenge him again. Now, at this point, it's all about them wanting to kill him. They're done trying to debate him. They're done trying to beat him in an argument. They can't do it, so now they're just going to try to kill him. And before that happens, though, he's going to really stick it in their craw with these 7 woes, all these woes we read about in Matthew 23. Luke and Mark both have a little bit in there about these woes, but Matthew goes into much more detail about the woes. And Jesus is really laying into these people and basically telling them the reason why they suck. I mentioned that last time, that Matthew 23 is basically one long the reason you suck speech that Jesus is giving to the Pharisees. Sometimes you got to do that. I mean, even Jesus did it here in Matthew 23. Sometimes you just got to tell somebody why they suck, why they're wrong. Like why they're so wrong in what they're doing. Sometimes you just got to do that. And Jesus did it here. I know it's okay to do that sometimes because Jesus himself did it. Like sometimes you just got to confront people's behavior for what it is and say this is wrong and you are wrong for doing these things. And if you don't stop doing them, disaster is going to happen. You're wrong, your behaviors are wrong, your attitude is wrong, at least these behaviors. And if you don't get into shape, whip yourself into shape and stop doing these things, bad things are going to happen to you. And that's basically what Jesus leaves it with. And then he weeps over Jerusalem at the end of Matthew 23. And we begin Matthew 24 with these words. Jesus left the temple. So he has now left. He has said all he's going to say to these people until they question him at the trial. It's like he has given them every warning that he can. He has given them every parable, every warning, he's answered all their questions, or at least he's answered them until they have no more questions to ask. And there's just no more words are going to get through to them. Okay, if they haven't been persuaded, and we've read about it in Matthew, we read about it in Mark, we'll read more about it in Luke and John. Okay, if they haven't been persuaded by what he has told them up to now, then they're not going to be persuaded by anything he says to them. So it's time for him to leave. He did this back in Ezekiel. We read this in Ezekiel, in the days of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a captive. He was in one of the early waves of captivity to Babylon. But this was while Jerusalem was still standing. So Ezekiel was in Babylon with some of the others who had been taken captive early in Babylon, while Jerusalem and the temple were still standing. But they didn't. But God wanted to tell Ezekiel and have him tell the people there, and captivity with him, Babylon, at the temple, that's not going to stay that way. The city's not going to continue standing. The temple's not going to continue standing, and they need to get used to that. There's not going to be a quick turnaround. They're not going to go back home in the next couple of years. They got to accept that this is not going to go the way they'd like it to go. And we read at the end, and we read in Ezekiel 10, verse 18, when he's having this vision, because Ezekiel is in Babylon, but he's having a vision of Jerusalem. And he says in Ezekiel 10:18, "Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim." So he's leaving the temple. They stopped at the entrance to the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the Lord of Israel was above. The glory of the God of Israel was above them. And then they went straight ahead. The last sentence of chapter 10 is each one went straight ahead. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the gate of the house of the Lord that faces east. At the end of chapter 11, in verse 22, it says, or verse 23, 22. "The cherubim with the wheels beside them spread their wings." Remember, these are the pilots of God's chariot. God is sitting basically in this elaborate chariot that's being driven by these cherubim and the wheels underneath them. So they're spread their wings, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. The glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it. So he's leaving the city. He's left the temple. He's leaving the city. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the exiles in Babylonia, and the vision given by the Spirit of God. So Jesus is leaving. He left the temple back in the day, in 600 or so, approximately 600 BC, and now he's leaving it again. This time is not in a vision form. This time he's physically getting up and walking out of the temple. Jesus left the temple and was walking away. So he has left. He has said all he can say. There's nothing more he can. Even Jesus eventually has said enough. He has said everything that he could possibly say to the people, the rulers, authorities, the chief priests, the ones in control. And we've read about it in Matthew. We've read about it in Mark. We will read more about it in Luke and John. Like, he has spent years now in debate and in discussion and controversy and confrontation with these people, and they are not going to listen to him. They're going to, and in fact, and they're done listening to him. They aren't going to listen to him anymore. They're not going to ask him any more questions. They have nothing more to say to him. He has nothing more to say to them. And now it's just about trying to kill him. Now it's just about trying to get him away from the crowds and kill him. The only time they're going to talk again is when they're speaking at the trial. Even then, Jesus is going to be mostly silent. So he has left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Now, he had just said his last words before he left the temple in the city. At the end of Matthew 23, he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you, desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So they're going to ask him about this. So he had just gotten done saying their house is going to be left desolate. This is prophetic language. This goes back to Jeremiah when he was saying that the house is going to fall, the house of the Lord, the temple is going to fall. So his disciples come up to him. So he left the temple and walked away. Then his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Now let's go ahead and flip to the other chapters. Mark 13. And read how they phrase it. As he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." So they want him to be impressed. The temple at this point was undergoing a massive, decades-long renovation project, begun by Herod the Great, like 40 years earlier. And John will read that it was 46 years earlier, at least in the first temple cleansing in John 2. But in Luke it says, some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. So they are calling his attention to how magnificent this building is. And this building, they're not even done with this renovation project. This is about the year 33 AD, early 30s AD. This project won't be completed until about 60 AD. I forget exactly when. But this temple renovation project, which had already been underway for 45 or more years, will not be finished for another 30 years. And they will only have the full thing in full operation for a few years before it's destroyed. So this was a magnificent building, which was still only about halfway through its renovation process at this time. And he had just said their house was going to be left to them desolate. So this is another one of those things where he says something and the apostles it just doesn't compute. We've seen this a lot in the Gospels, where Jesus will say something, mostly things that the apostles don't want to hear, like he's going to be turned over to the authorities and killed and crucified, or that the greatest in the kingdom of heaven has to be the least. And these are things the apostles genuinely did not want to hear at this point in time, and so they just don't hear it. Like the sound may go into their ears and bounce off their eardrums, and it may get into their heads, but they just don't comprehend what he's saying at all. And this is another one of those things. And he says to them in response, "Do you see all these things?" He asks. "I tell you the truth. Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." So he is not impressed by this building. He is not impressed by this multi-decades-long renovation project that they're undergoing. He's saying to them, don't get attached to this thing. This thing is going to be gone. Every stone in this building is going to be thrown down at some point. What he says in Mark is basically the same thing. "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." And in Luke he says, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." So he basically says the same thing in all three Gospels. They're all going to be done. What you see here is all going to be gone someday. Everyone will be thrown down. Now this shakes their world. Okay, they may not have really heard him when he said previously that the house is going to be left desolate. They may not have heard that. Their ears may have caught the sound waves that he was speaking, that he was making when he spoke, but they didn't comprehend that. But this they get. When he says this catches their attention. So, now here's the important point here. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said. When they need to know more about this. He can't just say this and leave him hanging. They've got to have more information about this. "When will this happen?" What's this? When will what happen? "I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another, everyone will be thrown down." When will that happen? "And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So they're asking him two questions here. They're asking him when this will happen. And what is this? Not one stone being left on another, everyone being thrown down. They're asking when that will happen. That's the fall of Jerusalem. That's the destruction of the temple. They're asking when that will happen, and they're asking what will be the sign of it happening. Okay? Let's go back now. Let's go to Mark and Luke and read those accounts too. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. So he has left the city. He's like he did in Ezekiel. He has left the city, and he's on the mountain east of it, opposite the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew. So we know now specifically there were four of them. Asked him privately, "Tell us." These are like the inner circle, the two sets of brothers who were the first apostles Jesus called: Peter and Andrew, James and John. Andrew, for some reason, doesn't quite make it into that innermost circle of three, but he's number 4. So Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen?" So when are these things? Not one stone here being left on another, everyone being thrown down. Okay, same question. When will these things happen? When will this temple be destroyed? When will these stones be thrown down? Because they hear that and they know he's talking about the temple being thrown down. There's no ambiguity in that. They hear that and they know he's referring to the temple being destroyed. So they want to know when that's going to happen. And what will be the sign that they are all these things, the stones being thrown down, about to be fulfilled? So in this, Mark doesn't have that second question split into two phrases. Matthew has that question split into two phrases. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now that's the same thing. He's equating, these are the coming and the end of the age are the same event. Okay, same thing. There's not two questions, and there's not three questions in Matthew. There's two questions. When is this going to happen, and what is the sign? Matthew splits up that second question into two phrases. The sign of your coming and the sign of the end of your age. But it's one question. What is going to be the sign? Mark says here, when will these things happen? When are the stones going to get thrown down? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled, that these are about to happen? Let's read Luke. Teacher, they asked, there's no indication that they went to the Mount of Olives here. When will these things happen? So again, when will these things happen? And not one stone being thrown left on another, every one of them will be thrown down. Same thing, same question. When is that going to happen? And all three of these accounts, the topic of the conversation is the same. Jesus leaves the temple. They call his attention to its buildings and how magnificent it is. He is not impressed and says, every one of these stones is going to get thrown down someday, meaning the temple is going to be destroyed. Which it did 600 years earlier in the days of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. Okay, so these men themselves were not alive back then, but this country has lived through this national crisis once before, about 600 years earlier. So they know that's what he means. So they ask him when that's going to happen. When will these things happen? These things being what he just talked about. Every stone being thrown down, not one after another. When will that happen? When will this temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place? So what will be the sign that this temple is about to be destroyed? That is the topic of conversation in all three of these accounts. Okay, it's about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. When is that going to happen? And what is the sign that's going to happen? Now, Matthew does make it a little more complicated for our minds today, because he has that second question split into two phrases, or two prepositional phrases. He still has the same two questions, and it's the same context about the temple being destroyed. And the only difference is that he splits that second question into two phrases. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? However, that is not two questions. That's one question. What will be the sign? But what that tells us is that the apostles equated his coming with the end of the age. They saw that as the same event. And they wanted to know when that was going to happen and what was the sign that it was about to happen. So that is the context of this conversation. They're not asking here, and Jesus is not going to be responding here about the end of the world. They are not asking that. That is not the question that they are asking, and that is not the question Jesus is going to answer. Okay? They are not asking about the end of the world. Jesus is not going to be answering about the end of the world. This conversation has nothing to do with the end of the world. All right. Now, in Matthew 25, which has material in it that Mark and Luke don't have, okay, the content of Matthew 25 is unique to Matthew. But in Matthew 25, Jesus will start telling parables that do start looking ahead to the final judgment. But that is not the context of Matthew 24 or Mark 13 or Luke 21. Okay? It is not. It is not about the end of the world. None of the conversation that they're going to have about when are these things going to happen and what's their sign that they're going to take place. None of that is about the end of the world. Not one bit of it. Not one thing Jesus is going to say. Until we get to Matthew 25 and he starts telling parables about what the coming of the king is going to be like. And then we do start kind of spinning the scope from the fall of Jerusalem to something beyond that. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, the conversation is strictly about the upcoming fall of the temple, which to them, to the apostles, is the end of the age. Okay? And they, as we find out in Matthew, they think that will happen at Jesus' coming. Okay? So they see those two things, his coming and the end of the age, as being part of the same event. And they see that, and they think that is going to happen when the temple falls, which it will. And they want to know when that's going to happen and what the sign of that's going to be. Now, this is a fact of history, okay? We know when the temple fell, and we know the circumstances that led to the temple falling. This is not a mystery to us today. When they are speaking this conversation in the year 30 or 33 AD, the events they're talking about are 35 to 40 years in their future. When these books are being written, these events are still in the future. We have to understand that too. That when these books, we have to understand the time context here, both of when this conversation was being had, and in which these accounts of the conversation were being written. Okay, the conversation was being had in the early 30s AD about events that would take place 35 to 40 years later. They're being written down in these forms sometime in the 50s or maybe early 60s AD, when the events that they're talking about still had not happened. Now, by the time we get to John, the events have happened, and John does not include this information because there's no need for him to, because the things Jesus is talking about in these chapters have already happened by that point in time. But when Matthew, Mark, and Luke are writing down their Gospels, the events that they're talking about here, the fall of Jerusalem and the things leading up to it, had not yet happened. So it was still important information for the Christians, especially the Jewish Christians, to have at that time in the mid-first century AD, to know when these things were going to happen and what signs to look for about when they were going to happen. Because they have to get out of Jerusalem. The specific warning that Jesus is going to give them is, when the sign does occur, when you do see it, I'm going to tell you what it is, and when you do see it, you get out of Jerusalem. You flee. You get out as fast as you can. You don't go down to get anything else. As soon as you see this sign, which we'll talk about, it's time to head to the hills. Quite literally, flee to the mountains. Get out of town and don't go back. Don't look back. Get out as quickly as you can, and don't look back. It was very practical advice, because if they had stayed, if they had not fled when they saw the sign, they were going to get trapped, and they were most likely going to get killed in probably very horrible ways. So it was very practical advice that they still needed to know at the time these accounts were first written. And I know this because all three of these Gospels have the same warning to the reader to understand what Jesus is talking about. We'll get to that when we get to that. Okay? But that is the context of this conversation. It's about the fall of the temple, which was going to happen in 70 AD as part of an ongoing war between Rome and Judea. And that was about 35 to 40 years after this conversation took place, about 10 to 15 years after these Gospels accounts were written. It's not about the end of the world. Now, in the Jewish mind, it is about the end of the age. And we will talk about that as we get through the Gospel of Matthew. Only Matthew separates that. Mark and Luke don't. They just say these things, when it was all going to happen. Matthew splits it into two things, the coming and the end of the age, which they count as being the same thing. And you have to remember, at this point in time, the apostles still do not understand the nature of Jesus' kingdom. They do not understand it's going to be a spiritual kingdom and not a physical one. They think that when he's going to come, he's going to obliterate the current system and set up a new one that will be a new age. That's what they think is going to happen. When he says that, that's what they assume he's talking about. That when he comes and becomes the king, he's going to obliterate the current system and set up a new one, and that will be the new age. And that does happen, but not the way they think it's going to. And we know from the rest of their encounters with Jesus in the Gospels, and even at the beginning of Acts, that they continue to misunderstand the nature of his kingdom all the way up until he's in the sky at the beginning of Acts. So they're not thinking. So when they ask these questions, we have to realize that they're not even thinking of his kingdom in the correct terms. So they're not thinking of his coming or the end of the age, per se, correctly. They're thinking about it and according to the understanding they had at the time, which is that when Jesus becomes king over Israel, that age will end and some new age is going to begin. Okay, so in the next video we're going to actually read the rest of Matthew 24, but this is one of the most misunderstood chapters in all of Scripture, and it's really important. It's actually pretty straightforward, as I said. They ask two questions. They're both about the same thing. Okay, and the context of the conversation is very obvious. They're talking about the fall of Jerusalem, which we know from history happened in 70 AD. So it's actually pretty simple and straightforward. But over the years, we have twisted it and made it into something much more difficult than it actually is. So to get to clear all that rubble away that we have built up over the years, I had to spend the video simply laying the groundwork for this. So we'll read the rest of Matthew 24 in the next video.